On November 22, 1963, aboard Air Force One parked at Love Field in Dallas, Texas, an unprecedented event was about to unfold. The nation was grappling with the shock and sorrow following President John F. Kennedy's assassination just hours earlier. In the midst of national trauma, the continuity of government was paramount. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson prepared to assume the presidency under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The decision was made quickly. Johnson needed to take the oath of office before returning to Washington, D.C., ensuring a seamless transition of power. Inside the aircraft, conditions were challenging. 27 individuals crowded into the confines of the main stateroom, a space merely 16 feet square. Compounding the discomfort, the air conditioning was inactive. The plane had been disconnected from external power sources to allow for a swift departure once the necessary formalities were complete. As events unfolded within the cabin, the aircraft's four jet engines began to power up outside, a low rumble underscoring the urgency of the moment. From the plane, Johnson placed a telephone call to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The advice from the late president's brother was clear: take the presidential oath before leaving Texas. Subsequently, federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes was contacted and rushed to Love Field to perform the constitutional duty. Her arrival marked a historical footnote. Judge Hughes's role was significant. It represented the first occasion a woman administered the oath of office to a president of the United States. Furthermore, the setting itself was unique, the only time such a ceremony has ever occurred aboard an airplane. At precisely 2:38 p.m. Central Standard Time, Lyndon Baines Johnson prepared to be sworn in. He stood within the packed compartment, surrounded by key aides and members of the presidential party. Instead of a traditional Bible, a Catholic missal belonging to the late President Kennedy, found on a nearby surface, was used for the oath. With Mrs. Johnson and Jacqueline Kennedy at his side, Johnson recited the solemn words delivered by Judge Hughes, officially becoming the 36th president. Immediately following the oath, President Johnson offered a gesture of affection to his wife. Mrs. Johnson then took Mrs. Kennedy's hand, conveying a message of shared national mourning for her husband. Official documentation of the event was carried out by administration personnel present for the purpose. 9 minutes after the conclusion of the ceremony, at 2:47 p.m., Air Force One accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air, charting a course for the nation's capital. That brief, somber procedure aboard the aircraft marked the start of Lyndon B. Johnson's first presidential term, which would continue for 1 year and 59 days. As Air Force One climbed into the sky, heading eastward, the small group aboard transitioned from the immediate necessity of the oath to the grim reality of the flight back to Washington, D.C. The atmosphere remained heavy with shock and grief. Inside the aircraft, the newly sworn-in President Johnson began the work of the presidency, making calls and conferring with aides amidst the hum of the engines. The urgency that had necessitated the swift ceremony continued unabated. Jacqueline Kennedy's presence during the oath-taking was profoundly significant. Her decision to stand beside President Johnson, despite her personal anguish, underscored the continuity of the office and the peaceful transfer of authority, even in the face of violence. Consideration was given to the difficult circumstances surrounding Mrs. Kennedy during the brief ceremony. Her positioning beside the new president was carefully managed, reflecting a sensitivity to the tragedy that had unfolded just hours before. The intention was to ensure the focus remained on the constitutional process and the stability of the government during a moment of national crisis. Cecil Stoughton, who had officially documented events for President Kennedy, was tasked with recording the solemn occasion. His presence ensured an official account of the succession was preserved for the historical record. His equipment captured the gravity and unique setting of the transfer of power. This hurried yet formal event underscored the mechanisms built into the U.S. system for immediate succession. The chaos of the day necessitated bypassing traditional locations and protocols. Judge Sarah T. Hughes's role remained a landmark detail, the first woman to administer the presidential oath. The location within the confines of the presidential aircraft added another layer of uniqueness to the proceedings. Subsequently, the flight continued towards Andrews Air Force Base. Aboard were not only the new president and the grieving widow, but also the body of the fallen leader, making the journey back to the capital a deeply somber one. During the flight back to the nation's capital, the weight of the day's events filled the aircraft. President Johnson, now vested with full executive authority, began the immense task of leading a stunned and grieving nation. Conversations were subdued. The primary focus was on ensuring stability and preparing for the difficult days ahead upon return. The presence of John F. Kennedy's casket in the aft section served as a constant, somber reminder of the reason for the urgent proceedings. Jacqueline Kennedy remained composed throughout the journey, her stoicism noted by those present. Her participation in the oath ceremony had been a powerful symbol of national unity during profound crisis. The use of the missile belonging to the late president added a poignant layer to the transfer of power. It was an unexpected detail in an already extraordinary sequence of events. As Air Force One flew eastward, the governmental apparatus continued to function. Decisions were being relayed, and the groundwork for Johnson's initial actions as president was being laid, even thousands of feet above the ground. The swiftness of the succession, occurring mere hours after the assassination, demonstrated the resilience of the American constitutional system. It was designed precisely for such moments of abrupt transition. Upon landing at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., President Johnson prepared to address the nation formally for the first time as its leader. He stepped off the plane into a country irrevocably changed. The events aboard Air Force One at Love Field concluded a harrowing chapter, but also marked the immediate beginning of a new presidential administration, born from tragedy yet tasked with moving the nation forward. Upon arrival at Andrews Air Force Base, the mood was somber, reflecting the gravity of the return to Washington, D.C. The new president prepared to disembark and face the assembled officials and press. President Johnson descended the ramp and stepped forward to a waiting microphone. He delivered brief remarks, acknowledging the profound loss and pledging continuity in governance. His words were broadcast to a nation still reeling, offering the first direct address from the newly sworn-in leader on home soil. He spoke of unity and resolve in the face of the national tragedy. Simultaneously, the casket bearing President Kennedy was respectfully transferred from Air Force One. It was a solemn moment, marking the physical return of the fallen president to the capital city. Jacqueline Kennedy accompanied her husband's casket, maintaining a remarkable degree of composure before the assembled onlookers. Her presence continued to be a focal point of national sympathy and respect. The unique circumstances of the oath-taking ceremony hours earlier in Dallas now transitioned into the immediate, practical demands of the presidency in Washington. The events aboard the aircraft had served their constitutional purpose. President Johnson then departed Andrews Air Force Base for the White House. He faced the daunting task of not only mourning his predecessor, but also immediately taking command of the nation's affairs during a period of intense uncertainty and grief. The government needed to function without pause, and the weight of that responsibility now rested fully on Lyndon B. Johnson's shoulders. The flight from Dallas had been more than a journey, it was the immediate crucible of a new presidency.